I met Charlie Cobb about 10 years ago when he moved to Jacksonville, but I knew about Charlie Cobb before he moved to Jacksonville. Charlie Cobb was an iconic name in the civil rights movement based on his work with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Charlie Cobb worked with SNCC and wrote the 1964 Freedom Summers program. He was a journalist. He helped found the National Association of Black Journalists, and he's in the Black Journalists Hall of Fame. He is a 2018 Carnegie Fellow. Mr. Isaiah Rumlin is the president of the Jacksonville branch, NAACP, and he has been president for the last 20 years. The NAACP is the only organization that works to put itself out of business. Everyone asks, how relevant is the NAACP? And no one recognizes the relevancy until they get in trouble and they need the NAACP. So we'll listen to Charlie Cobb, and then Mr. Isaiah Rumlin will come forth.
Okay, good morning, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this event. I really only want to say a couple of things. I could go on and on and on about the movement here in Jacksonville and elsewhere. First, and maybe people I was working in Mississippi during Axe Handle's Saturday. I was a field secretary for SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and I was engaged in work around gaining the right to vote. And the sit-ins in Jacksonville, particularly the violence associated with Axe Handle's Saturday, brought Florida to our attention all the way over there in Mississippi. I think people forget that to many of us who were outside of Florida, Florida was Miami Beach and nothing else. And one of the things the sit-ins did was bring Florida in a much more political way to our attention. And that really reflects, I think, the value of sit-ins that were unfolding all across the South. The second thing I want to say is that like sit-ins everywhere, but in Jacksonville in particular, the sit-ins here reflect an important thing about what began happening in 1960. And that is, for almost the first time, young people all across the South began to step into leadership roles. This is something of a first, this burst of young activism. Young people have always been involved in civil rights struggle, but it's the emergence of young people. Rodney Hurst is a good example of that, into leadership roles that is reflected in what you see with the sit-in movement. And that in some ways resonates with what's unfolding today with the movement for Black Lives, because again, we have a surge of young activism, and young people are taking leadership roles in the freedom struggle. Lastly, I want to say that what the sit-ins in Jacksonville represent and the sit-in movement right across the South represent, and it's important to understand in terms of struggle today, that as much as young people in Jacksonville or in Mississippi where I was, and in other places, in Washington, D.C. where my parents were, as much as young people's struggle challenge racism and segregation and white supremacy, the other aspect not talked about enough is that what these sit-ins, what these protests represent are the challenge that Black people made to one another within the Black community. This is really what powered the movement. And this is really, in some ways, the best way to understand what was happening here in Jacksonville. Thank you.